Friends in the Rain Bible Story. Crash! Crash! The dark sky rumbled with thunder as David walked through the woods. David looked up at the big clouds. The clouds were dark and thick. Splish! A cool drop of water fell right on David's nose. David wiped the drop off with his hand. Splash! Splat! 2 wet drops of water fell on the ground. The grass where David stood was getting wet. Splish! Splash! Splash! Drops of water began falling from the sky. Rain was falling everywhere. David pulled his coat tightly around his body. He began to walk faster and faster. David had helpers walking along with him. As David and his helpers walked, the drops of water wet the big brown stones that lay in the grass. Splitter, splatter! Everything was getting very, very wet. Quickly, David looked around. There was a big cave not far away. The big cave would keep David and his helpers out of the rain. "Let's get out of the rain!" cried David as he ran toward the big cave. Bum, bum, thump! David's helpers ran to the dry ground in the big cave. Big men, little men, quiet men, and loud men crowded together. Everyone wanted to get out of the rain. David leaned against a rock in the cave. His hair was very wet. Trickle, trickle! Little droplets of water trickled down his hair and onto his face. David started to wipe away the droplets with the sleeve of his shirt. But his shirt was soaking wet too. David sighed. This was a long, hard day. The rain was falling harder and harder now. "I'm cold," whispered one of David's helpers with black hair and strong arms. "Let's start a fire." "We can't start a fire," snapped a tall helper whose coat was torn and dirty. "We don't have anything for starting a fire." David walked over to the 2 men. The tall helper with the torn coat shook his head. "Please forgive me," the tall helper said. "I should not have been so unkind." "I will forgive you," said the helper with black hair and the strong arms. David smiled at his helpers as he sat down with them on the ground. "Men," said David kindly, "we are tired and we are hungry. Yet God will make everything turn out right. We do not have to be afraid. I am glad." Then a young helper rose to his feet. He was wet. He was shaking. "What about King Saul and his army?" "King Saul wants to hurt you, David," cried the young man. "If the soldiers follow our muddy footprints, they will find us here in the cave." David turned and looked at his helpers huddled together. Their feet were muddy and their clothes were wet. One man yawned and rubbed his eyes. Everyone was very tired. Suddenly, snap! There was a sound coming from the woods. Swish, swish! Someone was walking through the long grass. Someone else was out in the rain. David's men looked at each other. No one moved. No one talked. "Maybe King Saul's soldiers are coming," the men thought fearfully. Slowly, the men reached for their swords. No one wanted David to get hurt. Everyone was ready to fight if King Saul's soldiers found them. David began to move slowly. David peeked out from behind a rock and then stopped. David looked around very, very carefully as he stood in the wet rain. David walked out of the cave to look around some more. David! David, it's me! Called a voice. David jumped. Then David saw a man running out of the woods. The man was tall and strong. King Saul's own son Jonathan ran toward David. Jonathan was David's special friend. Jonathan! Yelled David. I'm so glad to see you. Jonathan and David gave each other a big friendly hug right in the middle of the rain. Jonathan looked at David's muddy feet. Jonathan looked at David's tired eyes. I am sorry you have to hide from my father's soldiers, said Jonathan sadly. You have to hide in the rain because King Saul, my father, does not like you. That is right, said David. We cannot go home to our warm beds and our happy families. Jonathan began to smile. David, he said kindly, God has chosen you to be king someday. Someday you will be the king, and all these troubles will be over. Then Jonathan gave David another big hug as the raindrops dripped off their noses. David, said Jonathan, I must tell you something very special. God knows where you are. God knows your feet are muddy. God knows your clothes are wet and torn. God will care for you. David smiled at his special friend. Yes, Jonathan, thank you for reminding me of God's care. I know God will care for me and all my helpers. Goodbye for now, Jonathan, said David, wiping the raindrops off his face. Goodbye for now, David, said Jonathan, wiping the raindrops off his face too. Splash, splash, splash! Suddenly, David's helpers came running out from the cave. The helpers ran right through the mud. One man stumbled. He fell right in the thick, gooey mud. Two other men with ragged clothes helped him to his feet. David, David, they cried. Let's get out of here. Hurry! David's men looked around quickly as they swung their swords in the air. Wait a minute, said David as his helpers gathered around him. The king's soldiers are not around here. They're not, whispered one man. But you were talking to Jonathan, the king's own son. The king's soldiers must be nearby. David shook his head and sat down upon a rock. Jonathan is my special friend, he said. Jonathan came to remind me that God still cares about me and my helpers. God cares about us? Asked a man with thick brown hair. God still cares about us? We are all muddy and cold. We are running from the king's soldiers. David smiled. Yes, God cares for us. God knows right where we are. God knows just what is happening. God will help us. God will keep us safe. A young helper sat down on the big rock by David. Then we do not have to be afraid, do we? No, laughed David. We never have to be afraid at all. As the man began to talk, the sky became lighter. The raindrops quit falling. The sun came out from behind the clouds. Sighed a small man with muddy feet. The sun feels very warm on my wet skin. All the men smiled. David smiled too. Yes, God is good, David thought. Everything will turn out all right if we trust in God.